The Progressive Era was a period of social activism and political reform that flourished from the 1890s to the 1920s. During this era of improvement, a handful of daring reformers endeavored to solve the nation's food and drug dilemma. Adulteration, the misbranding of foods and drugs, and openly selling patent medicines with highly addictive drugs had long been a fixture in America's cultural landscape. Harvey Washington Wiley, Upton Sinclair, and Samuel Hopkins Adams were the leading stalwart forces who campaigned for changes in the nation's food and drug laws. Their efforts led to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which stands as a crucial and long-lasting turning point in the regulation and safety of America's food and drug industries. Efforts to regulate food in America began during the early colonial period. The colonies enacted various food inspection laws, and by 1785, Massachusetts had enacted the first general food law. Be it therefore enacted that any person selling diseased, corrupted, contagious, or unwholesome provisions, whether for meat or drink, shall be punished by fine, imprisonment, standing in the pillory, or one or more of these punishments. In the 1800s, states had principal control over domestically produced foods and drugs. However, laws were legally vague and weakly enforced, doing little to cut down on the increasing problem of impure foods. By the late 1800s, the United States was becoming increasingly industrial rather than agricultural. More people lived in congested towns and cities, so they were unable to grow their own food. The reliance on distant markets for food grew. Improved methods of transportation, along with packing and manufacturing advances, permitted large amounts of food to be distributed over wider areas. Competition in sales became intense, and it tempted companies to adulterate and mislabel products to increase profits and stay in the business. Butter was regularly laced with lard. Wheat flour was cheapened by adding potato starch, ground peas, beans, buckwheat, and rice. Copper sulfate allowed bakers to use poor flour, and the bread gained weight by taking up large amounts of water. To recapture the rich, creamy appearance of true blue milk from the country, adulterants like chalk, magnesia, and plaster of Paris were used. Other traditional abuses were diluting honey with glucose and cheapening ground ginger with fragments of tarred rope. Poisons were directly administered in food through certain coloring material and preservatives like boric acid and the poisonous red oxide of mercury. In 1849, the California gold rush caused the canning industry to boom. Producers bought half-spoiled berries, naughty peaches, stale corn, and green tomatoes, canned them, and used pretty labels. Sometimes lead alloys containing zinc chloride were used to make the tinplate of cans. The metals were dangerous and poisonous, making consumers sick. Two events pushed the pure food issue further in public concern. Firstly, skepticism about the quality of American meat had long existed. In the late 1800s, an outbreak of trichinosis in Germany was blamed on American pork. Most European countries then excluded American pork products. Secondly, the European exploitation of these fears provoked the federal meat inspection laws of 1890 and 1891. By the 1900s, patent medicines flooded the market. These over-the-counter medicines containing highly addictive drugs like morphine and heroin were sold without restriction and were prescribed for almost everything, including bedwetting and ingrown toenails. Many baby products and cough syrups contained cocaine. None displayed warning labels. Patent medicine promoters promised swift and sure cures for all diseases, but they were all shams, rarely patented, and had little or negative medicinal value. As more people became addicted to what they thought were medicines and poisoned by what they expected to be wholesome food, reformers fought for changes in the nation's food and drug laws. Lawmakers faced heightened pressure to stand up to businesses that valued money more than the health of their customers. As a result, 190 legislative measures were introduced to Congress between 1879 and 1906, but none were passed. Congress refused to support the food and drug legislation. The leader of the fight for a pure food law, who helped improve the senators' pure food bills and instigated public and congressional support, was Harvey Washington Wiley. He was the chief chemist of the Department of Agriculture from 1883 to 1912. In 1902, he launched a scientific experiment to show the effects of additives in food. Wiley chose to use men instead of animals for the experiment because they differed in digestion, and humans were able to describe their symptoms. He launched testing with borax, a common food additive. As the borax dosage grew, appetites declined, and the subjects experienced feelings of fullness, discomfort, occasional stomach pain, headaches, and the inability to do work. Wiley published his conclusions in 1904. Shifting groups of volunteers swallowed capsules of other preservatives that made borax seem mild. The fact that a dozen young men deliberately dosed themselves with chemicals, risking their lives, caught the public's attention. Reporter George Brown gave Wiley's volunteers the name Poison Squad. His articles captivated a larger audience. Both the public and the representatives in Congress became more interested in the campaign for a national law. The Pure Food Bill inched upward as a national priority due to the publicity on the Poison Squad, increased speeches and lobbying by Wiley and his allies, and the growing progressive spirit. Wiley continued his role as a star witness at hearings and recruited other witnesses favoring the law. His willingness to compromise won over many opponents. He and his allies strove hard to preserve business support and were joined by women's organizations. Wiley urged President Roosevelt to support the Pure Food Law, and Roosevelt recommended the bill's enactment to Congress. Meanwhile, Samuel Hopkins Adams gained a reputation as a muckraker for his articles on the conditions of public health. As a writer for McClure's magazine, he researched the truth about patent medicines. He wrote a series of 11 articles for Collier's Weekly called The Great American Fraud, exposing the false claims of patent medicines and how they damaged consumers' health. Adams' articles had a huge impact, striking House members as extremely influential. Upton Sinclair, an American writer and muckraker, researched corruption in the Chicago meatpacking industries in 1904. Sinclair's The Jungle directed attention at the working conditions for laborers, but the public latched on to his short description of meat packaging practices. The brief descriptions in Chapter 14 were a searching expose of the flagrant violations of all hygiene laws in the slaughter of diseased cattle and the whole machinery of feeding a nation. The Jungle spurred a mighty reaction in the nation. Between Wiley's experiments and Adams and Sinclair's writings, the public became concerned for their health and pushed harder for a pure food law. On January 1906, Senator Weldon Hayburn introduced a Pure Food Bill to Congress. The major opponents to the bill were the well-financed brewers who in 10 minutes could fabricate what they labeled as 10-year-old whiskey. They were supported by shoddy wine merchants, importers of adulterated olive oils, and promoters of fraudulent remedies. The opposition recognized the changing climate, though. Senators offered amendments to bring the bill more to their liking, acknowledging that the bill would eventually pass. The act was signed on June 30, 1906, by President Roosevelt. The Pure Food and Drug Act was a law for preventing the manufacture, sale, and transportation of adulterated, misbranded, poisonous, and deleterious foods, drugs, medicines, liquors, and for regulating traffic therein and for other purposes. The act applied to goods shipped in foreign or interstate commerce, and was a significant turning point by requiring labels on products to be honest. The act was also a turning point because it led to the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. For the first time, a federal agency was entrusted with the responsibility of testing foods and drugs for human consumption. It required prescriptions from licensed physicians before purchasing certain drugs, and required label warnings on habit-forming drugs. 2 subsequent laws strengthened the act and power of the FDA: the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 and the 1962 Kefauver-Harris Amendments. Today, the FDA regulates a quarter of gross domestic products. The economic legacy of the Pure Food and Drug Act includes strong consumer safeguards, controls on pharmaceutical and medical device markets, and regulatory intervention in the process of pharmaceutical development and advertising. It was a necessary turning point because it gave the federal government gatekeeping power over human and animal drugs, foods, and preservatives. It is also the most daunting intrusion by federal authorities into interstate commerce. The act was a critical and essential turning point in the handling of America's foods and drugs, protecting the health and well-being of all American citizens.